Hi everyone, welcome back to my channel. First order of business is the copyright disclaimer. Second order of business is this is going to be my opinion on a true crime case. As you know, opinions are not facts, and my viewers are smart enough to listen to the information presented and to form their own opinion. At the outset, I want to say that the defendant, Stephanie Stearns, was found not guilty of the murder of Muff Graham. So let's just get that right out of the way. Star Bulletin's feature writer Steve Spence broke the story of one of the most sensational true crime cases in Hawaiian history, one of piracy and murder on the remote atoll of Palmyra, later made famous by Vincent Bugliosi in the book And the Sea Will Tell, and the popular press at the time. And I've recreated the wheel here, like I always do, by going to the source material where available, and only using Bugliosi's book as a final check or polish on the material I'm going to show here. Remember that half of Bugliosi's book is just a reimagining of the conversations between the individuals involved anyway. So let's go back, let's use newspapers.com, and let's go to the source. This is a current map of Palmyra Atoll, I do believe. Nature Conservancy owns it now, but let's go back to 1974. Palmyra is a character in and of itself, in my opinion. In a lot of books and a lot of stories, the place can almost be as much of a player. And Palmyra, an atoll, is formed by a volcano, and volcanoes are created from geological violence. So to me, it's really no surprise that there is almost like a curse thought of involved with this atoll. It's a violent place. Or let's just say it's a place of upheaval. Called the rainforest of the sea due to its abundance of fish and wildlife, Palmyra Atoll, which again is a coral rim of an underwater volcano, it sits 1,000 miles south of Hawaii. That's 300 miles north of the equator. The horseshoe-shaped atoll is comprised of a series of coral strands, 52 little islets, and it's about maximum elevation 5 to 6 feet above sea level. At the time of the events described herein, you could still find crumbling remnants of a Navy base. This article states, in fact, the Navy made Palmyra what it is today, a volcanic formation sprouting with coral. Palmyra was, and depending on the tide, still is, really a series of smaller islands. Sea bees used bulldozers to connect the isles, creating something like a misshapen U turned on its side, its open mouth facing west. The channel was dredged to allow ships to move easily into the deep interior lagoon. An airstrip was constructed for Navy bombers. Buildings, Quonset huts, and fortifications were erected for a base that quartered up to 5,000 men. On a side note, when I was doing genealogy.com stuff, or genealogy work, I found that my grandfather had been stationed outside or on Palmyra. This article notes it figured prominently in history during World War II when the Navy took it over and built a refueling station for PBY flying boats traveling to and from Australia and the West Coast. Basically, this pristine atoll was used as a base of operations for air and submarine attacks against Japan. And when the Navy pulled out, everything was just left a mess and to just go to seed, literally. This article states, the Navy had changed the place as completely as tourism has changed Waikiki Beach. Giant dredges during World War II turned the atoll and 52 tiny islands into 35. 3 natural lagoons became 2. Then the 6,000 troops sailed through a channel blasted in the reef. They built a wharf, airstrip, barracks, motor pool. They threw causeways to be used as jeep roads across the lagoon. Then they pulled out, leaving Palmyra to the fish and the birds and the crabs, and it was as if a great disaster had left Waikiki empty of human beings. What would be the result? At Palmyra, the result was an explosion of animal energy that astounds me. The atoll receives 200 inches of rainfall per year, and it's populated with palm trees, sandy beaches, dolphins, snails the size of your thumb, crabs. It's essentially the tropical Garden of Eden, but with sharks. The atoll also provides one of the last intact rainforests in the Pacific Islands and the only nesting habitat for migratory seabirds within 450,000 square miles of ocean. A red-footed booby bird colony, second only to the Galapagos Islands, is found there. It's also an ideal site for celestial observation because it's dark and you can see the stars, you can see everything out there. So while Palmyra is that kind of tropical paradise that the landlubbers often fantasize about, it is terribly, terribly remote. The nearest inhabited island is more than 175 miles away, and roughly that's a 2-day sail in a fast boat. The atoll was seldomly used as a port of call for boats going to the eastern sector of the South Pacific for decades. And at the time of this story, between like the 74 to 80, the 1980s, the atoll was privately owned by the Fullard Leo family. And now, since May 2000 and currently, it's owned by the Nature Conservancy. They said, "We are interested in buying Palmyra because of its outstanding rainforest, incredible seabird colony, and beautiful marine life. It's a dense tropical Garden of Eden." And I just want to say that they have done an excellent job rehabilitating the atoll, trying to remove all the naval debris. So the Nature Conservancy spent about $5.5 million removing some of the shipwrecks, and here's a picture of that. So if you watch the Sea Will Tell miniseries that came out after Bugliosi's book, that is not Palmyra, and it doesn't look a damn thing like Palmyra. Bless their hearts. That's not what Palmyra looks like. And let's get into just a tiny bit of folklore, because some people believed that Palmyra was cursed. That's just their opinion. But there was also some folklore that back in 1816, a Spanish pirate ship, and I believe it was called the Esperanza, was full of Incan treasures and had wrecked on Palmyra's reefs, and its crew supposedly buried the loot under a palm tree. Okay, so a lot of folks who went there just to salvage or to treasure hunt, they had that kind of stuff in mind. But like I said, it was a really remote island and a really long trip and far away from everywhere. So let's go back in time to the 1970s. This is the backstory of Mr. and Mrs. Malcolm Graham Jr. For 6 years, the wealthy Mr. and Mrs. Malcolm Graham Jr. of San Diego pleasure cruised the world in their $50,000 boat, the Sea Wind, that ended up on Palmyra. As a child in Stamford, Connecticut, Malcolm, known as Mac Graham, was reared in a conservative family. He went sailing with his sister on his father's boat, and their dad's sailing adventures inspired Mac and his sister Mary Graham McIntosh. The moment Mac inherited about $100,000 at age 28, they both bought a boat. Mac bought the Sea Wind for $20,000 and lovingly restored it. And just to give you some color, this article mentions how he was conservative, he loathed the welfare system, the tax system, he is vehemently opposed to gun control, and didn't like being told what to do. The only quirk in his well-ordered life seemed to be what he didn't want: a tedious career at a 40 hours a week engineering job, a ranch-style home in the San Diego suburbs, a picture postcard family. Well, that's not entirely accurate, because he had a picture postcard wife. He just didn't have children. And he would have probably eventually settled down in San Diego after this trip. I think it's important to note that Mac obtained a mechanical engineering degree from both the University of Connecticut and Michigan, and he spent 3 years in the Army in the Korean War stationed in the Pacific on the nuclear carrier called the Enterprise. So he had familiarity even through being in the Army, being out on the deep sea. Prior to 1974, Mac had been working as an engineer, and sometimes he also did some freelance writing and sold stories to travel magazines. But whatever work he did do, he really worked to sail, and the couple had no children. Mac met Eleanor Laverne Eddington, nicknamed Muff, while she was stalled in traffic, and he stopped to help her. This article reads, "One night, coming out of a bar, he and a friend came upon a car stalled in traffic. The driver was Laverne Eddington, single, a secretary and a year younger than Mac. She had pin-up good looks, and Graham, who is 5'10", darkly handsome, and something of a ladies' man, got her car running again and invited her back to the bar for a drink. A long-term relationship began. She learned navigation and seamanship and sailed on short trips with Mac down to Ensenada. And she joined him, sailing around the world with him for 6 years on the 38-foot ketch known as the Sea Wind. So they sailed around the world more than one time. And at this point in the relationship in 1974, Buck was at the point in life that she preferred to do the smaller voyages. Mind you, they had been married in August of 1961, and Muff did not want to go to Palmyra in 1974. But still, being the dutiful wife who really loved her husband and was going to follow him anywhere, she planned the trip to Palmyra for months, maybe even a year. She planned, and it involved, because they wanted to stay gone for 2 years, it involved a lot of storage, space making, and buying of supplies. And the trip started giving her nightmares to the point she obtained some tranquilizers from her doctor. This article states that Muff, at the age of 40, really didn't feel inclined to leave her opulent home in Southern California to sail the oceans for 2 years, but that Mac insisted. So they outfitted the ketch with everything from a workshop to refrigerated lockers, Muff's silk bathing suits, and even Christmas decorations, because they planned to stay there until Christmas. And Mac had promised his loving wife that this would be their last blue water sailing trip. When they pulled out of the port, Mac was 43 and Muff was 42. I love this little shown picture of Mac with many of his friends. Here's Mac in the dinghy in the left. And on the picture on the right is a picture of the Sea Wind that's outfitted for the trip to Palmyra. And the outfitting is not just food. The Sea Wind was equipped with auxiliary engines, a high-tech shortwave radio, and a complete tool shop. Along with an acetylene torch. Anything. They said that Mac could make screws. He could make anything. And the Grahams made friends everywhere they went. They even befriended a man named Kurt Shoemaker, who is a ham radio operator, and he thought it would be a good idea that every Monday and Wednesday he would touch base with the Sea Wind through their ham radios. So they were going to be in touch with the outside world at least twice a week. And so the story goes, with the Grahams aboard, the majestic Sea Wind set sail for Palmyra. And then we're going to talk about the other cast of characters in this story. So let's talk about the other couple featured in this tale. Here is Stephanie K. Stearns. She moved to Hawaii to help her uncle after he had a heart attack, to help him run a tourist business on the Big Island. This was probably about 1969, give or take. And then she lived for a while in a Hawaiian commune on the Big Island. So keep in mind, this is the early 70s. And her later attorney, Vincent Bugliosi, describes her as 5'4" and not one to win a beauty contest. What a sweetheart, Vince, right? Her previous arrests were a 0.5 gram of hash conviction and 2 shoplifting convictions, I think both from 1969, all on Kauai. Stephanie Stearns met Wesley Walker, otherwise known as Buck, in 1972. We're going to call him Buck. Wesley Walker has so many different aliases that he goes by, and we'll go through that. But his name herein is Buck. She meets him in 1972, and they both have dreams of living wild and free off the land. Buck had acquired 4 acres of land and lived in a primitive cabin and grew weed, otherwise known as marijuana. Now, back then, hippies were a certain type of folks. They weren't necessarily viewed as dangerous. But let's look at Buck's record. Buck, Wesley Buck Dwayne Walker, age 37, had a 9-year age difference with Stephanie. He was originally from Oregon. And I've noticed that a couple of people, when I sleuth them out, are also from Oregon. So I don't know if he knew some of these people, or if he moved them over to the Big Island. I don't know. I don't care. He was the son of a plywood mill electrician. He was an antisocial misfit. First arrested at age 12 for bicycle and car theft, burglary at age 14, stealing cars age 15, by 18 or 19, robbing a service station with a sawed-off shotgun, armed robbery in LA, and convictions in San Quentin prison before the age of 20. So he wasn't just growing pot on the Big Island and, woo-woo, lava lamps and bean bags and happy hippies. I mean, lest you think they were peaceable hippies, I in my opinion, no. Because the Mountain View property that he lived upon had a cabin near the Iola Forest Reserve, where the group allegedly lived, was booby-trapped with 24 bullet traps. Allegedly, it had live bullets because they had previously been ripped off by a drug dealer. So anyone coming upon it and tripping the traps could get killed. So the police were looking to bust this drug ring. And like I said, they found 24 set rat trap booby traps on the Gilbert property in Mountain View. And they say that there were 22 long bullets with the potential of killing. Now, they were after busting a whole group of people, which both involved arrests of both Stephanie and Buck. On June 15, 1973, Stephanie was arrested in Kona for distributing MDA, and she was the 10th person arrested in this major drug ring. Both Buck and Stephanie caught the MDA, well, it's kind of like ecstasy, but the MDA charges. But Buck pled guilty in federal court so that the charges against Stephanie were dropped. And he was convicted for distributing the MDA in Maui. But he was already on parole. Okay, so this was a problem. He did not want to go back to prison, like San Quentin type prison. So he didn't intend to do his time. So what he did was he assumed a new identity, this what he called Roy Allen, via a passport. So he donned clerical garb for this passport photo to become Roy Allen. So this ex-con, who was already on parole, turns fugitive. So almost 2 months after the major bust, so it's October 3rd, 1973, Buck buys a boat named Margaret, that's the name of the vessel, from a guy named Robert W. Remoir, I believe, from Oregon, strangely enough, at Kihei, which had been built in 1950. And then what Buck did was then he sold the boat, Margaret, but he renamed it Stephanie, and he sold it to his alias Roy A. Allen in April of 1974. That's what we call a straw man transaction. So he buys this old Margaret vessel, and keep in mind, and I'm going to talk about the Margaret a little bit more too because it becomes the Iola. The yachting community is like the drug community. The drug dealers know each other. They know what they sell. So do the yachters. They know the boats. They know what they sell. They know if they've been sunk. So keep that in mind. This guy's a dummy. This guy's a real dummy. So Stephanie Stearns is working at a bar in Lahaina while Buck is purchasing an old 1940s boat called the Margaret. And allegedly, Margaret was a wooden-hulled boat that had been sunken in Ma'alea Bay and then sat in dry dock for 2 years. And her mast had been snapped off during the salvage operation for it. So I love the name Margaret, but guess what? This Margaret was busted. It was a busted old sow. But Buck fixed it up and renamed it the Iola. And that's a bad omen. Sailors do not rename their boats. It's a bad, bad omen. And it certainly you don't rename a boat twice, because she was called the Margaret initially. He renamed it the Stephanie. Then he, did the straw man transaction and renamed it the Iola. Buck made a homemade mask for the Iola out of telephone poles and stuff. I mean, it's ridiculous. Buck knew drugs. Buck did not know sailing. And I know it might not feel important now, but there are going to be different versions of when the Iola was launched, okay? Dodgy stories about when she first was launched at sea, because you don't want to make it sound like right out of the gate she was unseaworthy, right? Because it was not her first launch on April Fool's Day, 1974, because it comes out in later trials, December 1973, the Iola was at a slip in the water, and a man named Daniel Peterson allegedly visited, allegedly left his wallet, and then claimed when he tried to get it back, he couldn't get it back. And then I think he filed a police report saying he believed the defendants took his wallet. So seemingly December 1973, the Iola was at a slip in the water. In the water means she'd already been launched, right? Then on another attempted launch of the Iola, I don't know if it was called Margaret or Iola then, it almost sunk, and Stephanie had to run to the Coast Guard station and use their bilge pump to pump the water out in order to save the vessel, because Margaret or Iola's own manual pump was overwhelmed. So she saved the boat on another occasion. So allegedly, by the time that the Iola was going to go off to Palmyra, so by the time that they believed the Iola was fixed up enough, seaworthy enough in their minds to take off, they were not planning on coming back right away, because Buck had charges. He was going to have to face those charges. He did not want to go back to prison. It didn't look good for him. Stephanie was in the clear, but she was going to go along with him. He was a fugitive, and she was going to go on the run with him, seemingly knowing all the things about his past. And when they took off, allegedly they had about 4 months of provisions on this vessel. And it was renamed the Iola, and it sails off the island with no damn radio. And we'll get into more about the Iola's problems. You know, Stephanie at this point had known Buck for 2 years, and she's throwing in her entire lot with this fugitive. You know, love is blind, whatever you want to call it. And allegedly Stephanie had bought a navigational book in order to learn how to get to Palmyra. And she said that Buck, on the trip to Palmyra, was basically useless once they got out to sea, and was seasick for many of the 28 days at sea. And this begins the meeting of fate between Wesley Buck Walker, Stephanie Stearns, the atoll of Palmyra, and the Grahams, Mac and Muff Graham, and the terrible, terrible tragedy that will occur.